awful lot has happened in that 43 years out at Sutpen's 100. Should we kind of talk a little bit about all of those developments? People
Yeah.
people died, new people came, uh, babies were born. There's a lot of activity.
Yes, that's right. And the first one there is that when that chapter opens, we get father's letter, Mr. Quentin's letter to Quentin at Harvard, telling him what?
Hello, welcome back to the Big Book Project. I'm Lori Feathers, and I'm very happy to be joined again today by Dr. Larry Allums, and he's been helping us dissect or explore or whatever kind of verb you want to use the dense and perplexing text that is William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. Welcome back, Larry.
Thank you, Lori. That's good to be here. And I'm happy to be engaged in this novel again, that's so exasperating and so brilliantly done. So, yeah, and here we are in chapter 6. It's not that we've mastered the first 5 chapters, but here we are in chapter 6. And it's going to get, to me anyway, even more interesting as we go into the chapters after this one. Because today we are introduced to another interlocutor. Some people call him a narrator, and that is Shreve McCannon, who is, of all things, a Canadian, and he and Quentin Compson are roommates at Harvard, and they begin speaking in this chapter about the whole saga of Thomas Sutpen and everything that revolves around him that we have been talking about for several weeks now. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'd like to maybe start our discussion of chapter 6 with the strange narration. But even before that, um, I maybe you can help me, Larry, kind of figure out why Faulkner kind of plops this character in Quentin's roommate Shreve, who obviously has heard some of this story before. He's got some kind of context about it, but there's Faulkner doesn't provide us with any exposition about the conversations that Quentin and Shreve might have had beforehand before we see him show up in chapter 6.
yes, yeah. Well, they're both freshmen, right? In Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard. And so apparently, in their just getting to know, and you're right, we don't know this, but in just getting to know this story of, maybe Shreve said, "What's it like where you're from?" Or "What have you been thinking about?" Or things like that. And then in some way, he posits the whole drama of Thomas Sutpen and his family. And then that really somehow it catches Shreve's imagination. Now, one of the things that we have to realize about Shreve is that, he is a lot different from Quentin. Uh, he is of the same age, probably like Quentin was born around 1990, 1890. And so he's right about the same age. But there's something about Quentin that can't be callow and flip the way Shreve is. For example, we see that Quentin gets kind of exasperated with him because he keeps talking about Aunt Rosa. And then Quentin says, "No, that's not right. You've got to get this straight." And all of the things and all of the concerns that Faulkner gives us are, we can identify them as well. There's a lot of southernness in that. And of course, all of that is foreign to Shreve. And he exhibits a sort of um, an inquisitiveness about what it's like to be from the South. You know, what do you all talk about? What do you do? Why does anyone even live there? And so all of these things, I think Faulkner very purposely gives us. Nothing in this novel that Faulkner doesn't give us is purposeful, but all of those things. And then in this chapter, and then further on, we begin to see Shreve change. We begin to see what happens when Shreve is really pulled in as a participant in this story, and he himself becomes a sort of a coalesced narrator. He and then we're going to see this next time we meet. You know that Shreve has really. I don't know if it's fair to say he's bought into the story of Sutpen, but he has absorbed it to the point that he's really invested in it now. And so I think that that's what one of the things that Faulkner wants us to see, that movement from being flip and insincere, right, casual, mocking somewhat, and then where he gets caught up in the whole thing. And I hope that's what's happening to us, you know, as readers as we go.
Yeah, I found chapter 6 amazing, if for no other reason than the consummate skill of Faulkner that it shows, how he's able to weave these different narrators into the conversation. It's almost like he blends them, but as the reader, you have like a difficult time knowing where the lines are, right? So Quentin will be talking, and then Shreve will pick up the story, or Quentin will be remembering that night back in September when he was still home and he had to take Miss Rosa out to Sutpen's 100, and some of the stuff that his father told him that night, and previously about the Sutpens. It's amazing just to think how he did this.
Oh, it is absolutely. I just don't know how he kept it all straight in his own imagination. But I haven't found in my readings of it, and I'm maybe there are some missteps, as the saying goes about the greatest of all poets, you know, Homer. Sometimes Homer nods too and makes a mistake, but I don't see that, you know, in this narrative. It's just kind of flawless. But and I think part of that is that there is so much that we really never know. You know, there, and we know that there are some central questions and central concerns that these narrators have. But think about it. Think about what it would be for a writer, a poet, to go from assuming the narrative stance of Mr. Compson with his cynicism, with his despair, you know, sort of on his sleeves, and then go from that to Miss Coldfield, Rosa Coldfield. All of chapter 5 in italics, and everything is from that perspective. How did Faulkner do that? You know, how can he so completely assume the character of Rosa Coldfield? That's just amazing to me. It really
Yeah,
is.
me too. So maybe let's talk about a little bit of what we think we learn in chapter 6. So um, Rosa hasn't been to Sutpen's 100 in 43 years since that humiliating incident that we talked about last time. And now she wants Quentin to take her back out there. And an awful lot has happened in that 43 years out at Sutpen's 100. Should we kind of talk a little bit about all of those developments? People
Yeah.
people died, new people came, uh, babies were born. There's a lot of activity.
Yes, that's right. And the first one there is that when that chapter opens, we get father's letter, Mr. Quentin's letter to Quentin at Harvard, telling him what, right? That Miss Rosa is been buried. She's dead and she's been buried. You know, so that's a big deal right there. And then the narrator comes in and describes the that the first part of that trip out to Sutpen's Hundred. And then that's when we hear that other voice of Shreve saying, "Tell about the South. Tell about the South," as though it's a big joke. And during this period, this was when so much fun was being made of the South after Reconstruction, and all of that. But what you're talking about is all of the, gosh, just name some of it. We get a better bird's eye view of Wash Jones, right, on Sutpen's Hundred, and his daughter Millicent, and his granddaughter Millie, right? And we learn what Sutpen is up to there because he's been abandoned by Miss Rosa, and so he's got to turn to other things. And then we go to New Orleans, and we've been to New Orleans in Mr. Compson's imagination, right, in chapter 4. And then now we actually go there and learn some things there about those sort of a constellation of characters around Charles Bond. So you've got, you want to just throw them out there and we can talk about them. Um, the one that Charles or Sutpen obviously married while he was still in Haiti, right? Her name is Eulalia. Eulalia. We don't know where that name came from, Bond. We don't know really whether that was her surname or not, or that is just something that I don't know, Charles or Henry or somebody put onto her in the telling of the story. But so we've got that, and then we have her showing up in New Orleans, right? Um, we don't know how that happened, but that's where she lives and where she finally dies. And then we and she becomes the octaroon mistress, right? Okay, and then that's where Mr. or Thomas Sutpen goes during Christmas of 1860, just before the war starts, right? Because he suspects, and do we know why he suspects something about Charles Bond? This-
I I don't know. I mean, Charles Bond seems, the way he's described, at least by the narrators, as
You're
kind of
frozen
like
up,
a
Lori.
dilettantish type of guy, very, very well dressed, too old really to be at Oxford with Quentin, too experienced. So there always seems to be a bit of suspicion about the fact that, what's he doing there? Why is he at Oxford? And I don't know, but I suspect that perhaps a a suspicion about there's also a suspicion, I guess, about Charles Bond's um, race, I think, right?
Yes, and there are two. I lost you for about a minute in there. I don't know whether I
Yeah,
missed anything you said.
I was talking about the fact that Charles Bond is kind of a dandy, very well dressed. He seems that he must be older than someone who should be at Oxford with Quentin. Um, and or I'm sorry, with Henry. I didn't mean Quentin. And then I was posing the question to you whether or not Sutpen has some suspicion about his race.
Yes, and what comes out, and this is conjecture. Apparently, you know, Thomas Sutpen is at home when Henry, who has been writing, and he's got a conveyor of messages back and forth between uh, the town, Jefferson, and the university, right? Which is now the University of Mississippi, right, in real life, which is about 40 miles. And so, he's told him about this new friend that he's met, and he's just so cool, and he's going to bring him home for Christmas, you know, and I'm excited about having you all meet him and so forth. And then the inference is And one of the later conjectures is that so here come Henry and Charles Bond, and Sutpen gets one good look at Charles Bond and knows. And what does he know? He sees in that face either himself or his mother, Charles Bond's mother, that is to say his wife. So that's what starts it all. And so then it gets to your question, about the first of all the color line, the blackness, and also the other thing is then, and that becomes a major factor, the incest, right? The kinship. And so on, we don't know what happened during that conversation that Christmas between Sutpen and Henry, the next Christmas when they come back again. But we conjecture that it was either or both the incest and the miscegenation, those two things. And Henry cannot pass on either of those really, And so this is when he says, "You will not marry my sister." And so then there's that four-year interlude. But then after that, other things happen, right? When Charles is dead and buried, then how does the baby who comes out of the marriage of Eulalia and Charles Bond, how does that baby get to Sutpen's Hundred?
Yeah, well, uh, the baby is brought there first, I guess, to visit the grave of Charles Bond with his mother. And I'm not quite sure how Judith uh, found her, having never been to New Orleans herself. But then once they learn that the mother has died back in New Orleans, then Clytie goes down to pick up the child and bring him back to Sutpen's Hundred. So um, maybe I'm asking you to speculate something that we don't yet know in chapter 6. But do we think that Judith and or Clytie have some of the same knowledge that Thomas Sutpen must have had about who this child really is?
That is really a good question. As far as we know, Thomas Sutpen and Judith never talked directly about these things. And as far as we know, um, Rosa doesn't know that Bond has Negro blood, nor does Mr. Compson. No, I mean, I'm sorry, nor does General Compson. So it turns out that it's something that Quentin discovered when. Now let's jump way to the end of the novel. We won't stay there, but we'll just jump there real quickly. He learned that when he goes with Miss Rosa to Sutpen's Hundred and has that last exchange. Okay, but now let's go back to chapter 6. Um, so, um,
And
how many?
also, Larry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but do we feel that Clytie goes to New Orleans to fetch the child on Judith's behalf, or does Clytie just decide? They a big point is made earlier in the novel that Clytie has Sutpen's face. So if there's some kind of recognition going on, maybe Clytie saw something in this child's face too that she suspected or knew. I- It seems that in these after Bond dies, it seems that Judith just becomes a little bit of a passive person, at least up through chapter 6. Like she's just she's always in that same gingham dress and the bonnet and just kind of like there, but everyone else is acting and she's just kind of present, except for the fact that now going back a little bit again into the chronology, but still in chapter 6, when she invites Charles Jr. into the house when he gets ill, right? And they both die of yellow fever.
Hmm. Yes, that's way later. Um, so I think, although again it's a lot of inference, I think that, and I get this from the way Thomas Sutpen treats Clytie, and this is one of um, Cleon Brooks's major points, that Sutpen's innocence, and we've not talked about his innocence. We're going to have to do that before we end these sessions, and what the nature of that innocence is. But Cleon Brooks gives as evidence of Sutpen's particular stance on African Americans or blackness, slaves during that time, or even after that post slavery, that he considers Clytie and Judith pretty much equals. When he comes in, he has that brainstorm that he's going to propose to Rosa. Do you remember that? And Clytie's there and Judith is there. And then Sutpen at first thinks to ask them to leave. And then he says, no, Judith and Clytie, Miss Rosa won't mind your hearing what I'm about to say. Right. So I think that, to answer your question directly, I think that Judith and Clytie Judith is very silent, but so is Clytie, right? And I think that they are both kind of on the same wavelength, and they must talk about these things. And so it was a joint decision for Clytie to go find Charles Etienne de Saint Valery Bond, right, with those five names, and bring him back, because now he's, whatever the circumstances are, he's effectually orphaned. He needs to be with, and this is the thing, he needs to be with family.
Hmm.
And this is,
Well,
go ahead.
can can I just ask you something? Because you've brought this up before about Sutpen's innocence, and it's a really I if I had to pick some adjectives to describe Thomas Sutpen, I would never pick innocent.
Okay.
And and I realize that someone can be a bad person and still be innocent, okay? Although we mostly, when we think of innocence, think about it has a more gentle, kind of connotation, like they're that they're just unaware but kind or passive. But what I don't understand about using that term with Sutpen is not so much that Sutpen couldn't be innocent and mean or evil, but Sutpen seems to be way too suspicious for me to think of him as innocent, because just what we were talking about a few minutes ago, he he looks at Charles Bond, and he's immediately like
Yeah,
something tips him off, like there's something not right about this guy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, I'll recur once more to Cleon Brooks, because I think he's got the best beat on this, because this has been talked about a lot by the major Faulkner critics. And mainly what they do is deduce, because Mr. General Compson is going to use the word innocence. And we've already seen in those first chapters the way Sutpen talks about his design, right? The design. And so many of the critics, most of the critics probably thought of Sutpen's innocence as a Southern innocence, right? Not being in the world, a kind of just a primitive kind of unfamiliarity with being out there among other people. But Cleon Brooks says that it's the innocence of the modern person, the innocence of modernity. That is to say, and especially American innocence, because that is to say, living according to a design, living according to an abstract plan that you've got. And I can understand that. And so the thing that, And we'll see. We haven't gotten there yet, but boy, that Faulkner is so good about hiding things until the right moment, right? But we'll see why. Um, I mean, let me ask you. Let's talk just a minute about what color is Charles Bond? What does he look like?
Yeah,
I mean,
we don't really know, but I guess my assumption was that that he must look something other than 100% Caucasian because that's why Sutpen runs off to New Orleans to try to find the secret.
yeah, and in addition to that, I think you're exactly right. In addition to that, how does he get in uh, admitted to that university if he's got any blackness apparent in his face, in his features?
Yeah.
He could never get in, and so he's not black. He's a shade or so not completely white, but he could pass, in other words, and we know that word, right? Passing. He could pass for white. Why?
Uh,
Yes.
could I just ask you something though? Because this has always perplexed me too. Because of the two, it would seem that Charles Bond is was more sophisticated than Henry. But if
Oh,
I read it right, Henry becomes an officer and Charles Bond remains just an enlisted man. Is this right?
no, it's the other way around.
Okay, other way around. All right.
Yeah, but because there's recognized when he joins, and think about that, they're not recruiting offices or anything like that, like we would imagine, but they were companies of men in places like Jefferson, who came together, elected a leader, and then they elected their own officers, their own enlisted men, and went off to war. So that's where he gets chosen.
So
And
then, presumably, no one in the military sees any blackness in Charles Bond, right? Because he wouldn't have, I mean, I understand that black soldiers were called on to fight, but it doesn't seem like they would ever be advanced in the ranks if there was a suspicion.
yes, yes, exactly. And the same way with his son, his and Eulalia's son, right? Whom Lester calls that bright boy. He's a
Yeah.
bright, you know. So yeah. Now, and that brings us to the question: why can't Sutpen accept him? Why can't Sutpen accept him as his son? Why must he divorce Eulalia and leave? And as we're going to learn, take nothing with him except the money that he's owed by Eulalia's father. So, what is it that keeps Thomas Sutpen from accepting those two, right? His wife, he could accept his wife. Why does he have to have a wife like Judith?
Or you mean like Ellen?
I mean, Ellen, yeah, like Ellen.
Well, I guess he probably, the only way that it would be acceptable to have a wife like Yulia would be if he were not living in New Orleans. I mean, it seems like there was a little bit of acceptability there that you could have because I don't know, Larry, you know this more than I, but as I understand it at the time, like the octoroons had their own community, and it was a um, it was a fairly sophisticated group of people,
Yeah,
um, and they lived quite comfortably, I think. But for some reason, I guess Sutpin um, isn't satisfied to live in the Caribbean or to live in New Orleans. He wants to uh, go into the interior of the United States, and I, I I haven't understood why that is.
yeah, and that's another thing that Faulkner withholds until you know the next chapter. When we learn Sutpen's earlier story,
Okay.
but it has to do with again the word that he has used for himself. and he's going to reveal to General Compson because they're friends, right?
Okay.
He's the only friend of only friend he's got in Jefferson is General Compson, and so that's where he talks really about his design.
Okay,
And
let's not give too much away from chapter 7.
but Mr. Compson suspects that in Sutpen, although he doesn't know when. In Well, again, we're going back a little bit to chapter 4 when he says, I've thought about it and thought about it. Something just does not compute. Something's missing. We'll see that same thing. And it all has to do with Sutpen's innocence and his design. But we'll leave that and wait until next time on that. But it's hard not to, bring that in.
Yeah, yeah. I guess another question that I had for you, um, which seems a little odd to me. So, moving up in the chronology of chapter 6, where we've got, I just keep calling him Charles Jr. rather than that long list of names,
Long
but Charles Jr. marries a black woman, and the way that she's described is really awful and so different from like the way that Clytie is described. And I wondered if there's a rhyme or reason for, I mean, probably she's darker skinned than Clytie, I guess, but it's a repetition here about, a really really ugly way to describe. I mean, it would have been common enough back then, but yeah, why is that, do you think?
Um, that's a very, very good question. It's a very Faulkner question, you know, but it partly has to do with um, perceptions of the times, for one thing, and we have to remember who's telling these stories, right? Who's narrating and what their words are. And I think it's really important for us to keep an eye on that, and then to know that whenever Mr. Compson says something, we have to regard it from Mr. Compson's standpoint, right? What kind of man he is, who is a very cynical, despairing man. He sees there's no hope in anything. But we do get the depiction of this woman, this wife of Charles Jr., as you call him, as being, what would you say, the extreme, um, almost an exaggeration. He has picked her out among all black women, right? As inescapably black, and also, as you say, well, you used the word, you didn't call her that, but ugly, right? She's depicted as not attractive in any way. And I think the question that we have to deal with is why? Why did he? And remember, here he is, and you're right about that society in New Orleans, that octaroon culture, and it was true. You can read about it. And then remember the image there when Mr. Compson is the one who talks about the trip that Henry and Charles make to New Orleans when Charles shows him that world. And the image, the overwhelming image of those octaroon mistresses is the sparrow, right? And that's a very biblical reference. His eye is on the sparrow. And what Charles Bond is, he's really making an apologia for that way of life. We are the ones who care about the fallen sparrow. Otherwise, she would be a prostitute. Otherwise, she would be a cast out. And here she is living this life, which we may not agree with, but that was the life that they lived. You know. So then you take that little boy who's 8 years old when he goes out there and sees his mom kneel on that pillow and cry over his father's grave. And then he, when he's older than that, well, I guess that's how old he is when he comes back, right? Is 8.
Yes, I think
And
so.
yeah, and so then he's gone from that world in New Orleans, the Octoroon's universe, to uh, the hinterlands of Mississippi. What's that going to be like? And there Clytie is every time a black child comes and maybe wants to meet him or play with him or something, then Clytie's out there shooing the black kid away and all of those things. So this is going to be an abrupt entrance into a different world for that little boy, for Charles Jr. And
Yeah.
so, and remember how they sleep? There are three beds.
Uh-huh.
Judith in the bed, she's white. Then Charles Jr. in the trundle bed, which is a white bed, white person's bed. And then where does Clytie sleep?
On the
On
pallet, on the
on the pallet
floor.
on the floor, right? Exactly. And then finally, he you're not told this, but then he's getting awareness. He's tuning in to a different reality, and he goes upstairs to live. He leaves and goes up there and locks himself in. And then one day, when either Clytie or Judith, I can't remember which, they are in there and they see that he's got a shard of mirror, and he's been looking at himself. Why has he been looking at himself? So
I think because he doesn't know which world he belongs.
who is he? Is he black? Is he white? But you see the glimmerings of his racial consciousness at that point. And so then we're still left with the question, though, that you raised: why does he react the way he does? And why does he go off and find this woman? He leaves Jefferson for a year, and he comes back not only with this woman, but what kind of condition is he in?
Yeah, he's been beat to hell. I mean, he just keeps instigating fights, and oftentimes it's not one on one, but he'll just instigate a fight, and a whole gaggle of guys will jump on him and beat him up. It From the descriptions, it seems like quite amazing that he is still alive because you would have thought that someone would have killed him by now.
Yes, exactly right. And in another novel, Light in August, uh, one of Faulkner's protagonists there is named Joe Christmas, and we never learn whether he's got any single drop of black blood in him, but he believes that he does. And so he's parchment colored. That's the way he's described. And he's a lot like Charles Jr. here. And so, again, though, we can ask him, there's no answer in the novel. Why would he do that? Why would he choose fights that he can't win and, you know, all of that?
Well, the fights, I guess m- maybe he doesn't want to live a life of ambiguity. And so perhaps
That's good. Yeah.
he's picking these fights so to see if if he's going to be considered black or white. And then after getting beat up a few times, he decides, okay, I'm throwing my towel in. I'm going to be black and I'm going to find the darkest woman that I can find to just prove that I'm not white, I'm black.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to explain it. I really do. And so then but he's still, I like your word, ambiguous. He's still got that ambiguity about himself, right? Why can't I be one or the other? Why am I, of all people, why am I mixed like this and have been put into this situation existentially? And this is the way he's chosen to deal with it. He
Yeah.
really has.
Yeah.
So, and Clytie and Judith, where do they live when Charles Jr. gets back to Sutpen's Hundred? They live in one of the old slave cabins,
Right, right.
you that Charles himself fixes up and pays rent for. But Clytie and Judith let him be there. What does that say? Even even though they could conclude that he's not a part of our family, does it indicate that they know somehow that he is a Sutpen, down the genealogical line, that
I
he's
I I
family?
I have to think that Clytie at least knows, given how she when the mother and Charles Jr. come to visit the grave, like Clytie's the one that's giving the boy like extra food, even though it's just after the war and there's really nothing to eat. And then, she travels. They make a big point of saying Clytie had never left the county
Yes.
prior to going down and getting the boy and bringing him back.
She, how did she get there? By riverboat, right? Good grief. And, how did she find anything and how did she get back? But she did.
Yeah.
That's miraculous. We don't know any of the
Yeah.
details of that trip, but it's pretty amazing.
Well, I wonder whether or not Clytie and Judith would have maybe permitted Charles Jr. to continue living in the house, but then when he marries, and I forget right now what his very dark-skinned wife's name is, but when he marries her, maybe they're just like, okay, that that's it. Like this is no longer acceptable because you're clearly whereas you might have been passing before, now you're just like something else.
Yeah. Um, Actually, I think that it is. I'll have to go back and look at this, but I think it is Charles Jr. who makes all the demands. He insists that he's not going to be any expense to them, so that's why he pays rent.
Yeah.
He makes his own way with that woman, and of course they do have a baby, right?
Yes, Jim Bond, and Jim they describe as saddle colored, which I thought was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, which is probably that means he's a little bit. I don't know. I guess saddles are a lot of different colors, but that probably means that he's little bit less white than Charles or even Charles Jr. The bright, but he's still that's the one that Luster describes as that bright boy. So he's still not not black. He's still,
Right.
you know. So, I, you know, maybe I just want to be generous to with both Judith and Clytie, but I think they have this familial piety in them that they really do want to care for them and see them. And it's Mr. Compson who says, who talks about women, right? So much. And he talks about women lead beautiful lives. You remember that passage? Women,
Yes.
women lead beautiful lives, don't they? And he's always being dismissive of that. But I think at the base of it all, he's talking about a kind of a principled life they live that men don't. That there's a faithfulness, there's a sense of piety about things that men don't have nearly as much as they do. But I think they're always in concert about about their attitude toward their family. And again, real quickly from chapter 4, remember it is Mr. Compson who conjectures that there was no courtship between Bond and Judith because Henry was there every minute. You know,
Yeah, right.
it was Henry who courted Judith. So, and he says in his own cynical way, it was the perfect incest. Sex without having sex, and that kind of thing. So, but I do think that the picture of them, the portrait of them, is essentially positive.
Yes.
In other words, I don't think that they imbibe of the customary prejudices of the South at that time.
Can can we talk a little bit again about the narration, which is kind of where we started? Um, this chapter 6, is not 100% in italics, but there's a lot of italics here.
Yeah.
And I speculated that maybe the italics are to indicate Mr. Compson's narration, but that could very well be wrong. So, do you have a theory or a view on that, Larry?
Um, I don't know whether I have a theory, but I have some thoughts about it. And not only the italics, but when Faulkner discovered his parentheses key on his typewriter, he went crazy. You know, and so in this chapter, I don't know whether you noticed it or not, but there is a parenthesis on page 152, and we can just go to it real quickly. Um, Down toward the bottom of the page, about the 2/3 of the way down, you've got the italics right there, and then suddenly, about 2/3 of the way down, you've got dashes and the parenthesis. Do you see that?
I do.
And
It starts
and then
how.
how was it? Shreve said. So Shreve breaks in, to Quentin's thinking here. That parenthesis is closed. Go over to page 175.
Not until then. Wow.
Last word of the chapter, and there it is, the closed parenthesis. So, what does that mean? How are we supposed to regard that as a, a different kind of narration, a different emphasis put on it?
Well, it seems that it can't all be, the parenthesis cannot all be Shreve here, because
No, it's not.
we know that, we're talking about what Mr. Compson said, and then we talk about when Quentin and Mr. Compson went hunting and what the tombstones look like.
Yep, yep, yep. All of
Oh,
that.
here's another something, Larry, that I was curious about. There seems to be a point made about the fact that in the cemetery, that this on the family plot, Judith is buried kind of further away than the others. And does it all have something to do with who was paying for the headstones and how, or
I don't think it's that. I think, and Mr. Compson has some thoughts about that. And you're right. That emphasis comes within those parentheses when they visit during that rainy day, and and Luster's with them, right? And so they talk about all of those tombstones, who paid for them, and eventually they talk about what's on the tombstones. And in Judas, she's over at the at the margin, on the periphery of the cemetery plot, the family cemetery plot, and it's got this kind of got almost a sermonic kind of thing. Pause, stranger, and take note, and talks about how what a terrible life. Who put that epitaph there?
well, I thought that she wrote what she wanted on her tombstone, right?
Well, she wrote some things, but she didn't write that. And it turns out that Miss Rosa wrote that and paid Judge Benbow to put those words on there, so there's
Okay.
Judith. And so the conjecture is, one, Mr. Compson's conjectures is that, well, if she died of yellow fever, somehow the one who buried her didn't want her with the others, or whether there might be some infection that spread. But the other is, there, that Judith was different, and she deserved to be apart from those. So, but we don't really know that.
Yeah, I do recall, now that you say it, that there was some kind of weird thing about, they make the point that between the time that Judith died and Charles Jr. died, there was a difference between, like, what the I don't know, the legend, or the rumor, or the supposition was about contagion for
Yes.
yellow fever.
Yeah, and what I think they died in 1884, something like that.
Yeah. I think that, it's just so wonderful that we have this whole long, dense chapter in we have this whole long, dense chapter in, um, chapter 6, and yet we've never really gotten off of square one, because we go back in time, but we still don't know.
Yes.
if there's someone in that house. Except, well, we do know because at the very end, um, Quentin says or tells Shreve, yeah, there was someone out there, but then it just ends again. So the pacing, the pacing of the novel is rather interesting as well.
Yes. Oh, yes, it is. Um, and I like to think, although this may not be true, but I like to think that Faulkner was in control of it the whole way through. So he knew exactly what he was doing. But boy, that would be extraordinary if he were. And he really revised this thing a lot. As a matter of fact, even after it was published, he revised some of these very things that we're talking about
Okay.
because he wanted it to be a little clearer, maybe even for himself. And so things like who knew about Bond's Negro blood, you know, and I've already mentioned that before, but but they didn't get into the book until it was republished. It was published by Modern Library at first, and then it came out in the Vintage. So yeah,
Well,
it's,
he might have wanted to be a little clearer, but I don't think he wanted to be too clear because
no,
this
he didn't.
this is not a straightforward narrative by any means,
No.
even after the revision.
Well, and you remember you're the one who brought up the italics in this
Yes.
last part. All of that's within the parentheses. Then this is on page 170, 171. That's where we get that I don't know who did it, but that Rosa maybe put on Judas' tombstone that threatening epitaph there. And look, all that's all in italics, right? And then turn the page over to 172. We're getting very close to the end of the chapter. And then in that paragraph toward the bottom of the page, what? But you were not listening. Who is uttering that? Who is saying you were not listening?
I think that's
Say it.
Quentin to Shreve, right?
Well, um,
Oh no, no,
I
no,
think
no, that can't be. Had absorbed it already. So that's someone talking to Quentin, but
yeah,
but is it Mr. Compson or is it
I
Rosa?
think it's a, I think it's an, I think it is what we would call an omniscient narrator who just puts himself in there at that point, right?
Okay.
Because if you go back, I mean, it's very difficult to keep up with. And I don't know, maybe many readers say it's just not worth it keeping all this straight. And I have a sympathy with that. But back on page 171, toward the top, after that epitaph that Rosa has put on Judas Stone,
Yeah.
about 10 lines from the top, um, well, no, not that far, about 6 or 7. This is Quentin clearly. Yes, to too much, too long. I didn't need to listen then, but I had to hear it. And now I'm having to hear it all over again because he sounds just like father. Who is that he? That's Shreve. So, but Shreve doesn't start talking. Beautiful lives, women do. And then we revert to what obviously is Mr. Compson's narration. Miss Rosa ordered that one too, right? And then we get over to page 172, and that paragraph toward the bottom of the page, then you suddenly get that intrusion of the you, but you were not listening,
So
reverting back to Quentin.
it seems then safe to say that the italics in chapter 6 is very different than the italics in chapter 5 insofar as I believe the
Yeah,
italics in chapter 5 is all Rosa, and here we've got an amalgam of narrators, even some that aren't personified or embodied, that are just omniscient, talking
yeah,
kind of at the same time.
yes, yeah, exactly right. And so over on page 173, about 6 or 7 lines down, no, you were not listening. You see it toward the end of the line. No, you were not listening. You didn't have to. But then that indicates that that's Quentin talking to himself. You didn't have to.
Yeah.
You'd already heard it. the dog stirred Rose and everything, and so then they take Luster, and then he's suddenly with Mr. Compson again, but you're still in italics. Those italics are still there, so it's not at all clear. Okay, and then they start talking about Jim Bond, the
I,
hulking, slack-mouthed person that you were talking about earlier. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I really love this aspect of the book where the part that you read before, but you were not listening because you knew it already, had learned, absorbed it already without the medium of speech somehow, from having been born and living beside it. And this whole, of course, the novel is very atmospheric, but Faulkner does a really good job, I think, of this idea of like a generational memory, or maybe even like memory kind of being in the land itself,
Yeah,
so that there's this knowledge that maybe no one ever specifically told you, or you didn't specifically read it, but there's this kind of uh, sentience about like what has happened or went before.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. It's sort of in the current of the air that you breathe if you're there. And Faulkner had that as a, and not only Faulkner, but a lot of what we call Southern writers have that as a sense of the the South, because the South is a traditional society. And what that means is, that things were told and happened many years and even ages ago, but they're carried forward,
Yeah,
and so then you don't have to ask about them. They're not unfamiliar to you. And so I think this is what's going on with Quentin. So I think that's really a good way to put it.
yeah.
So,
Well,
but
I think we'll break here unless you've got something else that you wanted to bring up before we do.
no, unless you want to tell me why Faulkner, why Faulkner let some, I don't know, 25 pages go between parentheses. What was his purpose? Because we normally think of parentheses as a, well, what do we think of it as a sort of a diminution of importance. If you put something in parentheses, it doesn't hold the same significance as something that doesn't have them. And yet, everything we read in these pages is really significant.
Yeah, I would think so. I wouldn't want to skip the pages that the parentheses encompass.
Yeah.
I'd be
I,
even more confused.
yes. I'm the same way. And so then the last words of that chapter, wait, then Shreve said, for God's sake, wait. And that makes us want to go forward.
Yeah, I really do like Shreve's voice here because I do think it adds a little bit of levity to all of this. I mean, the content of what they're talking about is so tragic and so heavy that I think that Shreve's incredulity and impatience here is kind of a little bit of a leavening of what otherwise is pretty despairing.
It is despairing. And you think about what, a cynical stance, why be cynical about something? And among other reasons is to get some distance from it because it's so devastating, right? So he's looking at it askance, at least
Yeah.
for now. But then we're going to see that change in the next chapter.
All right.
So,
Well, I
okay.
can't wait. I can't wait
Can't
to
wait.
talk with you about that chapter. And just thank you so much. It's always enlightening to talk to you about this book, but yeah, I think you're really, and readers have commented on the Substack that you're really helping them kind of put this together, which oftentimes I think just looks like I'm a huge lover of jigsaw puzzles. This book seems to me that you just would like, throw all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle across the floor and then try to like put it all together again.
That's good. Yeah. Well, I'm happy to be back in the novel too. So thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you soon.